I still remember the sound of the rain that morning. It wasn't heavy, just soft enough to blur the world outside my window. I was sitting there, staring at my reflection like I had done 1,000 times before. Same face, same eyes, but something in me felt different. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was surrender. Or maybe, for the first time in my life, I was just done pretending to be someone I wasn't. I'd spent years building this version of myself that everyone could accept, the quiet, responsible boy who never argued, never questioned. But inside, there was this ache that never stopped whispering, this quiet voice that said, "You know who you are. You've always known." That morning, I finally listened. It didn't happen suddenly. It wasn't like a lightning strike. It was a slow, trembling breath that turned into a decision. I went to my closet, that same old wooden closet with chipped paint, and opened the door like it was some kind of portal. And in a way, it was. Hanging there was the outfit I'd bought months ago but never dared to wear. A soft cream sweater, a long floral skirt, and a scarf that shimmered faintly in the light. I remember touching the fabric with shaking fingers. It felt too gentle for me, too kind. But maybe that's what I needed, kindness. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in my life, I let myself be soft. The first thing I noticed wasn't how I looked, but how I felt. When I pulled that sweater over my head and smoothed out the skirt, it felt like slipping into a memory I'd never lived but always wanted to. My heart was racing, my hands trembling, and yet, I felt calm, a strange kind of calm, like a storm that had finally passed. I looked in the mirror, and for a second, I didn't recognize myself. But then, I smiled. Not because I looked perfect, I didn't, but because for once, I looked like someone I could love. Of course, that peace didn't last long. My phone buzzed, a message from my best friend, Mia. She wanted to drop by, like she always did on weekends. My heart sank. I almost tore everything off, but something in me stopped. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was fear, maybe both. I texted back, "Sure, come over." I had no plan, no idea how to explain any of this. When she knocked on the door 15 minutes later, I could barely breathe. I opened it, expecting shock, maybe laughter. Instead, she just stared for a long second and whispered, "Oh my God, you look happy." That broke me. I started crying before I could even speak. I told her everything, the confusion, the guilt, the years of hiding, how I'd always known but never had the courage to say it out loud. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she just walked up, hugged me, and said, "Then be her. The world will adjust." Those words, they still echo in my head. The world will adjust. For the first time, I believed maybe it could. But not everyone did. When my brother came home that evening, he froze at the door. The silence between us was heavier than anything I'd ever felt. He asked, "What is this?" I tried to explain, my voice cracking, but he just shook his head and walked away. He didn't yell, didn't argue. That somehow hurt more. Later that night, he left a note on my desk, "I need time." I cried myself to sleep holding that piece of paper, because at least it wasn't rejection, it was space, and that was something. Days turned into weeks, and I started stepping out, more small things at first. A walk in the park, a coffee run, buying groceries. Each step felt like walking a tightrope between fear and freedom. People stared sometimes. Some smiled. Some didn't. But each time I came home, I realized the world didn't end. The sky didn't fall. I was still here and more alive than I had ever been. There were nights I still doubted myself, though. I'd sit on my bed, take off my makeup, and ask, is this really me? Or just a dream I'll wake up from? But every morning, the answer felt clearer. It wasn't a dream. It was finally real. The turning point came one afternoon at my mother's house. I hadn't told her yet, I was terrified. But I couldn't hide anymore. When she opened the door and saw me, she froze. I could see 1,000 emotions cross her face: confusion, pain, love, fear. I started to speak, but my voice broke. She looked at me quietly, then reached out, touched my cheek, and said, "I knew." Just those 2 words. I didn't even realize how long I'd been waiting to hear them. "I knew," she repeated softly. "I just didn't know how to help you say it." I fell into her arms and cried until my chest ached. After that, something inside me changed. Acceptance didn't come from everyone, but it came from enough people that I began to stop needing permission. The girl I saw in the mirror each morning was no longer a secret or a costume. She was just me. The way I brushed my hair, the way I smiled when I caught my reflection in shop windows, all of it felt natural now, unforced. There was this small joy in simple things, picking an outfit that matched my mood, feeling the breeze against my skin, walking confidently without shrinking into the background. Every day felt like reclaiming pieces of myself I had buried long ago. But the real transformation wasn't just in clothes or name or how I looked, it was in how I felt when I woke up. Before, I used to open my eyes and dread the day. Now, I woke up curious, hopeful, even excited. I used to think transformation was about changing who I was. I was wrong. It was about becoming who I had always been. I realized the person I used to call him was never fake, he was just a version of me surviving until I could finally live. That understanding brought peace, the kind I never thought I'd earn. One evening, I sat at my favorite cafe, watching the sunset paint the windows gold. A little girl at the next table smiled at me and said, "I like your earrings." Her mom looked embarrassed, but I just smiled back and said, "Thank you." It was such a small thing, but it meant everything. That innocent kindness, that unfiltered acceptance, it reminded me that the world isn't as cruel as it sometimes feels. Some hearts just understand without needing explanations. Months passed, and I started sharing my story online, not for attention, but for connection. Messages began pouring in. People who felt trapped, people afraid to speak, people just like me. They said my story gave them courage. I cried reading every one. It's strange, isn't it? You spend your life hiding because you think the world will never accept you, and then when you finally show yourself, you realize you were never alone. Of course, not every comment was kind. Some were cruel, some mocking. But I learned to let them go. Pain doesn't define you, how you rise from it does. And for every hateful word, there were 10 more that said, "Thank you." That's what kept me going. I realized my journey wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to every person who had ever looked in the mirror and felt a stranger staring back. It belonged to everyone who'd ever whispered, "Maybe someday," and needed to know that someday can be today. Last week, I visited my brother. We hadn't talked much since that night. When he opened the door, I saw something shift in his eyes, surprise, maybe pride. He said, "You look happy." I laughed. "I am," I told him. There was a pause, and then he hugged me tight, like he didn't want to let go. I didn't realize how much I'd missed that. "I'm proud of you," he whispered. I'll never forget that moment. Because in that instant, all the fear, the rejection, the nights I cried, it all made sense. It was worth it, every second. So here I am now, sitting by that same window, watching the rain fall again. Only this time, I'm not hiding behind it. The reflection staring back at me isn't a disguise or a dream. She's real. She's me. The girl I always wanted to be, not because she's perfect, but because she's honest. Because she's alive. And maybe that's what becoming yourself really means. It's not about changing what people see. It's about finally seeing yourself clearly, after a lifetime of fog. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: you can spend years waiting for permission to be who you are, but the truth is, no one can give it to you. You have to take it. You have to stand in front of that mirror, face the fear, and whisper, "This is me." And once you do, once you stop running from the person inside you, that's when the world starts to open up. Not because it changes, but because you finally let it see you. The day I became the girl I always wanted to be wasn't just the day I changed my reflection. It was the day I stopped apologizing for existing. It was the day I chose truth over fear. It was the day I stopped surviving and started living. And if you're listening to this, wondering if you'll ever have that day, you will. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but someday, when you're ready. Because who you are has always been waiting, patient, brave, and beautiful just beneath the surface. So when that moment comes, don't hide. Don't wait for the world to understand. Step into the light, breathe, and say it with every heartbeat: I am here. I am real. I am me. And that's the most beautiful transformation of all. After that night with my brother, life started to feel possible again. Not easy, not simple, but possible. There's a strange kind of peace that comes after chaos when you've already faced the worst of your fears. The rest of the world's noise doesn't hit as hard. I started to rebuild not from scratch, but from truth. Every morning felt like a small act of rebellion. Getting ready wasn't a chore anymore, it was a celebration. Picking clothes that matched how I felt inside, doing my hair the way I'd always wanted, walking out the door without the armor I used to wear, these were little victories. And yet, every step outside still carried a pulse of fear, like a heartbeat reminding me that freedom always costs something. I remember the first day I applied for a new job. I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of my blouse, whispering to myself, "You belong here." The interview was in a small design studio downtown. The receptionist gave me a quick up and down look, not cruel, just curious, and smiled. That simple smile loosened something in me. During the interview, I spoke with a confidence I didn't know I had. I told them about my passion for creating things that make people feel seen. When I walked out of that building, I didn't even care if I got the job because for the first time, I hadn't hidden who I was. 2 days later, they called. "We'd love to have you on the team," the manager said. I just sat there, staring at my phone, tears welling up. Maybe the world really was adjusting, one heart at a time. The first weeks were challenging. Some co-workers were warm right away, asking questions, learning my name, treating me like anyone else. Others, not so much. There were whispers sometimes, glances when they thought I wasn't looking. I pretended it didn't bother me, but it did. I'd go home at night and stare at my reflection again, not to check how I looked, but to remind myself why I was doing this. I wasn't trying to prove anything to them. I was just trying to live. And somehow, that realization gave me strength. Then there was Alex. He was quiet, thoughtful, the kind of person who listened more than he spoke. We started working on a project together, and slowly, I realized he never looked at me with that question in his eyes that others had. He just saw me. One evening, we stayed late finishing a design. When everyone else left, we sat by the window eating cheap takeout. The city lights reflected on the glass, and he said softly, "You know, you seem lighter than most people. Like you've already done the hardest part." I smiled. "Maybe I have," I said. "Or maybe I just stopped pretending." He nodded, and for a while, we just sat there, watching the rain blur the skyline. That was the first time in years I felt seen, not as an idea, not as a label, but as a person. But life has a way of testing you the moment you start to feel safe. One morning, as I walked into work, there was a notice pinned to the bulletin board, an anonymous complaint. It wasn't signed, but I didn't need to guess who it was from. It said that certain people were making others uncomfortable. My hands shook as I read it. I didn't even need to see my name. I knew. My heart sank, not because of what it said, but because it reminded me that acceptance is never given once you have to keep earning it, over and over. That day, I wanted to disappear. I sat at my desk, staring at the screen, unable to focus. When Alex saw me, he didn't ask. He just placed a small sticky note on my desk that said, "You are not alone." I didn't cry there. I waited until I got home, where the tears came quietly. Sometimes, that's what courage looks like, not fighting back, not proving a point, but choosing to keep showing up anyway. The next morning, I walked into that same office with my head held a little higher. And you know what? The world didn't crumble. Work continued. The whispers faded. The people who mattered stayed. The rest didn't. One night, my mom called me out of the blue. She asked if I could visit for dinner. I was nervous. It had been a while since I'd seen some of the extended family. I almost said no, but something in her voice told me she wanted me there. When I arrived, everyone was already seated. The conversation stopped for a moment when I walked in. I could feel the weight of their eyes, the questions unspoken. My aunt smiled hesitantly. My uncle nodded. It wasn't warmth, but it wasn't rejection either. It was something in between, a quiet curiosity, maybe even the beginning of understanding. During dinner, my cousin asked softly, "So, how are you?" I laughed. "I'm good. Better, actually." And for the first time, I meant it. Later that night, as I helped my mom clear the table, she said, "You know, they'll come around. People just need time." I smiled at her, tears threatening again. "You did," I said. She nodded. "I did. Because I realized the hardest thing wasn't accepting you, it was forgiving myself for not seeing your pain sooner." That sentence broke something open in me. We stood there in the kitchen, holding each other, both crying not out of sadness, but relief. Healing isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's just two people finally telling the truth. Months went by, and life started to feel normal. I know that word doesn't sound like much, but to me, it meant everything. Normal meant peace. Normal meant walking through a crowd and not shrinking inside myself. It meant laughter with coworkers, morning coffee runs, music in my earbuds as I walked to work, the kind of quiet joy I used to envy in others. I still had bad days. I still doubted myself. But those moments didn't define me anymore. I was learning that happiness isn't some constant feeling. It's a choice you make again and again, even when it's hard. One evening, after work, Alex asked if I wanted to grab dinner. I hesitated, not because I didn't want to, but because part of me was afraid. What if this meant more? What if he didn't really understand? But when we sat across from each other at that little Italian place near the river, it felt easy. He asked about my family, my favorite books, what my childhood was like. I told him bits and pieces enough for him to see the whole without needing every detail. At one point, he looked at me and said, "You know, you're one of the bravest people I've ever met." I laughed. "You wouldn't say that if you'd seen me crying in my bathroom last week." He smiled. "Courage isn't about never crying. It's about being real." I didn't know what to say to that. Maybe because he was right. That night, as we walked by the river, the air cool and the city lights reflecting on the water, he asked quietly, "Do you ever miss who you used to be?" I thought about it for a moment. Sometimes, I admitted. Not because I want to go back, but because I wish I could tell that version of me that it gets better. That someday, all the pain will make sense. He nodded, and for a while, we just walked in silence. It's strange how real love sneaks up on you. Not like a storm, but like a sunrise, slow and certain. I don't know when exactly I started feeling it, but I remember the first time I realized it. It was months later, during a team event. We were laughing about something ridiculous, and I looked at him across the room, the way he smiled, the way his eyes softened when he looked at me, and I just knew. My heart didn't race out of fear anymore. It beat out of recognition. That's what love is, I think, recognizing a home you didn't know you'd been searching for. But I was scared. Scared of being too much, or not enough. Scared of history repeating itself. I told him once, "You deserve someone simple." He laughed gently. "No one's simple," he said. "But you're real. And that's all I've ever wanted." I don't know what the future holds for us. Maybe it'll last, maybe it won't. But that's not the point. What matters is that I finally let myself be loved, not the version of me the world once expected, but the version I fought to become. That's what this journey has been about all along, not perfection, not approval, but truth. Sometimes I still look in the mirror, not out of habit, but gratitude. I see the same eyes, the same smile, just softer now, freer. The reflection isn't someone new. It's someone finally whole. The girl I always wanted to be isn't an ideal or a dream anymore. She's standing right here, breathing, laughing, living. And when people ask me what changed, I tell them the truth: nothing and everything. The world is still imperfect. People still judge. But now, I walk through it as myself. And that, somehow, makes all the difference. Because at the end of it all, transformation isn't about escaping who you were, it's about embracing who you've always been, without fear. And that's the story I'll keep telling, again and again, for anyone who needs to hear it. Because the day I became the girl I always wanted to be wasn't just one day. It's every day I wake up and choose to live as her. And that choice, that quiet, beautiful choice, is everything. It's been 3 years since that first morning, the one when I stood trembling before the mirror and decided I was done hiding. 3 years since the day I took that first uncertain step toward the person I was always meant to be. Sometimes, when I think back, It feels like a dream, soft, distant, almost too fragile to have been real. But then I'll catch a glimpse of myself in a window, sunlight touching my hair, and I'll remember, no, it happened. I lived it. I survived it. I became me. Life now is quieter, but fuller. I wake up before the sun most days, make coffee, open the curtains, and let the morning light spill into my apartment. There's a small plant on the windowsill that I can't seem to keep alive, but I keep trying. Maybe it reminds me that growth doesn't happen all at once. Some mornings I sit at my desk, scrolling through messages from people who've found my story online. Their words still break me in the best way. You made me feel seen. I'm scared, but I'm trying. Thank you for giving me hope. I read them slowly, one by one, and every time I think if all my pain led to even one of these messages, then it was worth it. But it hasn't been easy. The world doesn't stay kind forever. There are still stares, still cruel words from strangers who know nothing about me except what they think they see. But I've learned something powerful: their opinions don't shape me. They can't touch the peace I built. I used to fight every cruel comment like it was a battle for my existence. Now I just breathe and remind myself, I don't owe anyone an explanation. I don't need permission to exist. A few months ago, I was invited to speak at a small community event. They called it Journeys to Self. At first, I almost said no. I was terrified that standing in front of people would make me crumble. But something inside whispered that maybe this was the next step, not for me, but for others who still couldn't speak. So I said yes. The day of the event, my hands shook as I walked onto the stage. The room was small, maybe 50 people, but every face felt like a mirror of my past fear. I took a deep breath and began. 3 years ago, I said, I thought I'd lost everything. I was wrong. I was just beginning. I told them everything, not just the beauty, but the loneliness, the doubt, the nights when I wanted to give up. I told them how becoming myself wasn't magic. It was messy, terrifying, and painfully human. When I finished, the room was silent. Then a woman in the front row stood up, tears in her eyes, and whispered, "Thank you." That's when I broke. Not from sadness, but from gratitude. I realized that my voice, the one I used to hide, had become someone else's courage. After the talk, a teenage girl approached me. She was shaking, clutching a small notebook. "I want to be like you," she said softly. I smiled and told her, "Don't be like me. Be you. That's the real victory." Her eyes glimmered with something I recognized, that fragile hope I once carried like a secret. Watching her walk away, I felt a quiet sense of purpose settle inside me. Maybe this is what it was all for. Not long after, I visited my hometown again. It had been years since I'd walked those streets, the same sidewalks where I used to keep my head down, hoping no one would notice me. The same bus stop where I used to sit, dreaming of escape. Everything looked smaller now, quieter. I stopped by the old school and stood outside the gate, memories flooding back: the teasing, the loneliness, the way I'd smile on the outside while breaking on the inside. For a moment, I wished I could hug that younger version of me, the one who thought happiness was meant for other people. As I turned to leave, I saw my old teacher, Mrs. Jensen, walking across the parking lot. She stopped, squinting, then smiled. "I almost didn't recognize you," she said. "You look radiant." I laughed softly. "It's been a long journey." She nodded. "It always is, isn't it?" There was something so grounding in that exchange: no judgment, no shock, just gentle recognition. Sometimes, that's all we ever need. Back home, life continued in its quiet rhythm. Work at the design studio grew more fulfilling, not just because I loved what I did, but because I finally felt like I belonged there. People stopped whispering. They started asking for my ideas, respecting my voice. Even the ones who had once avoided me began to change, slowly, without words. I didn't need apologies. Growth was enough. Alex and I still talk, though life has taken us down different paths. What we shared wasn't about romance, not really. It was about seeing each other at our most vulnerable and choosing kindness anyway. That kind of connection doesn't fade, it just transforms. He's dating someone now, and when he told me, I smiled genuinely. "I'm happy for you," I said, and I meant it. Because love taught me something. Real love doesn't always mean forever. Sometimes it just means being brave enough to show up when someone needs you most. But life had one more surprise waiting for me. Last winter, during the holidays, my brother called. He asked if I wanted to come to dinner with his family. I hesitated, thinking of how distant we'd become despite his quiet acceptance. Still, I said yes. When I arrived, his daughter, my niece, ran up and hugged me tight. "Auntie," she shouted, giggling. The word hit me like sunlight breaking through clouds. Auntie. It wasn't planned. No one corrected her. My brother just smiled across the table, a quiet warmth in his eyes. That moment meant more than any apology ever could. After dinner, he pulled me aside. "You know," he said, "for a long time I didn't understand. But watching you live, it changed how I see everything." He paused. "I'm proud of you." I swallowed hard, trying not to cry. "You already said that once," I whispered. He smiled. "Yeah, but I needed to say it again." That night, driving home through the snow, I realized I'd spent so long fighting for acceptance that I'd forgotten how beautiful it feels to finally have it. These days, I teach art classes on weekends. Not professionally, just small workshops for people who need a space to feel free. There's something magical about watching someone paint for the first time, seeing them discover parts of themselves through color and light. One of my students once asked me, "How do you know when a painting is finished?" I told her, "When it finally feels honest." She smiled, not realizing that's exactly how I knew my own transformation was complete. It wasn't about perfection. It was about honesty. Sometimes I still have moments of doubt. I'll wake up, stare at the ceiling, and wonder if I've done enough, if I've become enough. But then I'll catch my reflection's sleepy eyes, messy hair, traces of last night's laughter, and I'll remember, this is what enough looks like. It's not a destination. It's the quiet confidence that comes from living truthfully. A few weeks ago, I found that old cream sweater, the one I wore on the first day of my transformation. It was tucked away at the back of my closet, a little worn now, but still soft. I slipped it on and looked in the mirror. It still fit, but differently. Back then, it was armor, a symbol of the girl I hoped to become. Now, it's a reminder of the woman I already am. I smiled, whispering to my reflection, "You made it." I often think about what I'd tell the person I used to be if I could go back. I think I'd say, "You don't have to earn love by pretending. You don't have to shrink to be safe. One day, you'll step into the world as yourself, and the fear will fade. Maybe not all at once, but enough for you to breathe." And maybe that's the lesson of it all, that becoming yourself isn't about changing into someone new. It's about remembering the truth you buried under years of noise and expectation. It's about daring to live it, even when it's hard, even when you're scared. The day I became the girl I always wanted to be wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of 100 smaller ones, moments of courage, kindness, and quiet triumph. And every time I see someone else take that first trembling step toward themselves, I feel the same flutter in my chest that I did that morning years ago. That's how I know I'm still becoming. Because transformation isn't a single moment. It's a lifetime of choosing to be real, no matter who's watching. And if my story has taught me anything, it's this: the world doesn't need perfect people. It needs honest ones. So I keep walking forward, one sunrise at a time, still learning, still growing, still becoming. And every now and then, when the rain starts to fall just like it did that first morning, I stop, close my eyes, and whisper to the sky, "Thank you." Because I finally understand. The girl I always wanted to be was never waiting somewhere out there. She was always right here, inside me, waiting for the day I was brave enough to open the door. It's been years since that day, the day my reflection finally smiled back at me. Sometimes I forget how far I've come, how impossible it all once felt. I wake up now and brush my hair without flinching at the mirror. I walk through the city without fear of eyes following me, whispering. It's strange how ordinary it feels now. Something that once felt like rebellion just feels like breathing. But every so often, a little tremor reminds me where I started, how fragile that courage was in the beginning. Last week, at the coffee shop I go to every morning, I met a kid. They couldn't have been more than 16, sitting in the corner with their hood pulled up, pretending to read. I saw their reflection in the window, eyes darting, like mine used to. When I got up to leave, they stopped me. "Excuse me," they said softly, "I know you don't know me, but how did you know?" I didn't need to ask what they meant. I smiled and sat back down. "You don't always know," I told them. "Sometimes you just feel it, like a song you've been humming your whole life but didn't know had words." They smiled back, a small, nervous smile. I could tell they were still scared, the kind of scared that keeps you awake at night, wondering if the world will ever let you be who you are. And in that moment, I saw myself trembling, uncertain, hoping for a sign that life wouldn't always hurt this much. I told them about my own first step, not the big one everyone sees, but the quiet one that happens long before that. The day I stopped apologizing for existing. The day I said, maybe I deserve to feel whole. It sounds small, but that's where it all begins. Sometimes people think transformation is a single moment, a change of clothes, a name, a decision. But the truth is, it's thousands of moments stitched together with pain, hope, and grace. It's crying at 3 a.m. because you miss the person you never got to be. It's forgiving yourself for taking so long. It's realizing that no matter what anyone says, you have a right to take up space in this world as yourself. When I left the coffee shop that day, the air felt different. The sun hit the glass windows, and for a second, I saw both of us reflected there, me and that kid who still had so much road ahead. It reminded me that every act of courage plants a seed in someone else's heart. Maybe I was once someone's seed too, without even knowing it. Later that evening, I went home and opened the box I keep on my dresser. Inside were a few things from my old life: a tie, a photograph, a small silver ring I used to wear when I thought blending in was safer than being seen. I don't look at them often, but I don't throw them away either. They're part of the story, not something to erase, but something to understand. I've learned that becoming yourself isn't about hating who you were. It's about loving who you're becoming more than you fear who you've been. That's the real transformation, when compassion replaces shame, and the mirror becomes a friend again. Sometimes, people tell me I'm brave. I always smile, but inside, I think no, I was just tired of pretending. Maybe bravery is what happens when exhaustion finally meets truth. Every night before bed, I light a small candle on my windowsill. It's a habit now, something to remind me of the girl I once dreamed of being. The flame flickers softly against the glass, and for a moment, I see all the versions of me reflected together: the frightened child, the hidden teen, the confused adult, and the woman who finally learned to exist without apology. The world didn't suddenly become kinder. People didn't all understand. But I stopped needing permission to be real. And somehow, that changed everything. If you had told me years ago that I'd laugh this freely, that I'd walk down a street and actually like the sound of my own name, I wouldn't have believed you. But here I am. The day I became the girl I always wanted to be wasn't just one day. It's every day I wake up and choose honesty over fear. And now, when I pass by mirrors in stores, on buses, in windows, I always pause for a second. I smile at the woman looking back, and I whisper, "We made it." Because we did. And if someone, somewhere, still feels trapped behind their own reflection, I hope they hear me when I say this: you are not broken. You are becoming. And one day, you'll look in the mirror and see what I see now: not perfection, not fantasy, but peace. That's the real ending, not a transformation into someone new, but a homecoming to who you were meant to be all along.